All right, hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the fifth lecture in the Africa Asia lecture series. My name is Rajeshwari and I am a member of the Asian Student Research Committee and I will be your host for today's lecture. As a reiteration, lectures in this series are held fortnightly where youth from diverse regions come to speak about matters of concern in today's world. For this lecture series, we have joined the United Nations 75 Dialogue and I'll provide a brief introduction of what it is. In January 2020, United Nations, on the occasion of their 75th founding anniversary, decided to launch a global directive initiative aiming to hear what young people have to say and engage to the best of their abilities in building partnerships with them around the world through online engagement, social media, and virtual dialogues to inspire individuals to take action, starting from doing so in their own lives. The speaker of today's lecture is Simran Borges, who will be talking about the Indian diaspora in Africa, discussing whether that is India's new soft power tool. Simran is a member of the Asian Student Research Committee at the International Association for Political Science Students. She is pursuing a bachelor's in international relations and media at the University of New South Wales. In her lecture, Simran aims to illustrate the increasingly important relationship between India and Africa in light of their navigation of China as a rising global power. Through her lecture, she attempts to contribute to the knowledge and understanding of how the Indian government can utilize their diaspora in Africa as a strategic tool for diplomatic, cultural, and economical influence over the region. Without much ado, I would like to now invite Simran to join us and begin her presentation. And as a small note, I'd like to add that you may write to us any questions you have during the lecture in the chat box, and we'll try our best to address them at the end of the lecture. Simran, the floor is all yours now.
Thanks, Rajeshwari. I'm just going to share my screen. All right. Can you guys see the screen?
Yeah, it's visible.
All right, sweet. All right, so the India-Africa relationship is one that has become of increasing importance, especially as both countries try to navigate the rise of China as a rising global power. Between China's Belt and Road Initiative and the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, India is now being forced to look for economic and political opportunities outside of Asia, which is where Africa comes into the picture. So although China is also pursuing Africa as an important strategic space, India has something that might give it a bit more leverage in this geopolitical battle, which is its diaspora in Africa. So essentially, the focus of this lecture then is looking at how India's diasporic population in Africa provides some sort of leverage in this geopolitical battle, I guess. So before I start, I'm going to just sort of break this lecture down into 3 points. The first is going to be just like a quick brief overview about India's diaspora in Africa. And then I'm going to look at the impact of the Indian diaspora in Africa on India's economic interests and then its impact on political and diplomatic relations. But before I do that, I just wanted to quickly give this whole like idea of India's diaspora some context within IR theory. So this is a quote that's from Nathan 2015, and it's just about his observations of the international political relations. So he says, in the contemporary international system based on balance of power considerations, mere perception by any one state that another is attempting to dominate or become hegemonic in pursuit of its own national interests would invariably trigger reactions from another state or states who might feel threatened by a rising power, or at the very least being put at a disadvantage in the new strategic environment. So I thought that was really interesting because it sort of gives me themes of like realism and like realist relations or like realist theory in terms of international relations. And then if you look at this whole idea of like India's diaspora in Africa, it sort of fits in with that whole idea, right? Of like trying to like dominate another hegemonic power. So in this case, it would be India trying to counteract China's power in Africa. So basically how it can use its diaspora to do that. But if we think about the concept of diaspora, it sort of, and engaging with diaspora, it sort of seems to fit in with the opposite of realism, which would be liberalism, because essentially liberalism is all about removing focus from state actors and looking at non-state actors and the impact of them. And it's also about cooperation, right? So about it's this positive sum game and about like mutual beneficial outcomes. So if we look then at what underpins India proactively engaging with their diaspora, it seems less about this liberal idea of like, you know, just doing it for cooperation, but then it also seems to have this idea of this realist tenant, right, which is about counteracting this hegemonic power, which is essentially China. So anyways, yeah, it serves as like an interesting balance to consider when you're looking at this battle for Africa, essentially. So now if we look at a brief overview of the Indian diaspora, I'll start first with the definition. So essentially, what is a diaspora? So the International Organization for Migration defines it as immigrants and their descendants who live outside the country of their birth, either on a temporary or permanent basis, yet still maintain effective ties to their origin countries, and they include migrants and their descendants. So India's diasporic history with Africa dates back to over 3,000 years. If we look at it on like a broad timeline on a broad spectrum, we could sort of split it up into 4 key waves, which are slightly different depending on what source you get them from and also who you speak to, I guess, but they essentially cover the same trends. So 2016 describes these as such. So the first wave, you have your traders, your businessmen, and your entrepreneurs. And then this stage was focused on those who migrated mainly towards the east coast of Africa. And this was right after the significant Dow trade that occurred between Africa and South Asia. And then the next sort of wave, which is sort of, they all sort of like link, you have this colonial period. And then this reflects the discourse put forward by modern historians who have identified that India's migration to Africa has its roots in colonialism, essentially. And then this wave was when Indians were sent to Africa as indentured laborers and agricultural hands for obviously the British Empire. And then you got the third wave, and then this again kind of relates directly to the second wave, which was the colonial period. Because this was the wave when a majority of those who had come as laborers and agricultural hands had stayed back in the country after their contracts had ended. And then many went to work on railroads. They also worked as tradesmen and cooks and cleaners, etc. And then this sort of increase, I guess you could say, in economic activity then led to many becoming clerks and doctors and lawyers who came between early to mid 20th century. And interestingly, this was also the group that Mahatma Gandhi was a part of. So now we got your last wave, and then this stage of diaspora arrived during a time when African states had just got their independence. UNC 2016 points out that most of the Indians that had migrated during this time were your businessmen, your traders, your financial workers, many working in the ICT sector, telecommunications, and yeah, finance. So yeah, the trends of Indian migration to Africa were, and I guess still are, varied. As the different stages show, there wasn't really a single reason why Indians migrated to Africa. It was essentially like a multitude of different reasons. And it also should be noted that one important theme that you can see between all 4 like stages is this point of migrating for economic motives for whomever that may be. So we can see that during like the colonialism period, they migrated, they were laborers and hands for the British economy, right? And then obviously the third wave, your fourth wave, you got your businessmen, tradesmen. I mean, there's like that theme of like coming to like link to the economy in some way or like businesses in some way. So it is also important to, and probably relevant to mention, that the cultural contributions of India's diaspora on Africa, and this was mainly, of course, through Bollywood. Again, the presence of Indian cinema in Africa also dates back to the colonial times. The first notable arrival of Bollywood was also around 1920. And then if we go back to those 4 stages, that's sort of like that third wave. And then this was a result of entrepreneurs who had come to Africa and they had set up like film, like movie theaters to screen Bollywood films, but then also Hollywood and British films, as Bert's 2019 notes. So the import of Bollywood films and culture into Africa was, I guess you could say, well received for the most part. One of the main reasons for this, and UNC 2016 points out, is the sort of similar cultural characteristics that India and Africa share. One of the main ones, I guess you could say, is this whole idea of their collective culture, which is one that many Asian countries actually share as well. This whole idea of folks prioritizing family values and putting the collective over the individual. So for example, Bollywood movies would represent the importance of family and keeping a good name. They would show people living in villages, living amongst animals, eating with their hands. And then this many African countries could relate to as well for the most part. So if we now look at what India's diaspora looks like in Africa today, it's only become stronger. Currently, Indians in Africa make up around 12.3% of India's total diaspora around the world. And I guess it should also be noted that India has one of the largest diasporas. And Indians in Africa reside in about 46 countries all over Africa. So they're dispersed pretty widely. The largest number of Indians is in Mauritius, and I'm pretty sure they make up 60% of the population in Mauritius. So it's clear then that the links between India and Africa run quite deep. Not only do they share similar cultural values, but they also have shared histories if we look at the whole colonial ties, right? And that's pretty significant. So this has proved to be very useful, as it has provided a solid foundation for both countries in terms of their engagements, and not just diplomatic, but economic too. So now if we look at the impact of diaspora on economic interests, if we look at now again the impact of China, right? So I sort of mentioned before China's Belt and Road Initiative, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. India's sort of being forced to look at other avenues to advance their strategic and economic interests. Although China is also pursuing Africa as an important strategic space, I guess it should be pointed out that China is currently Africa's largest trading partner. The trade value between the two reached 185 billion in 2018, while the Africa-India trade was about 60 billion during that same period. Also, Chinese investment in Asia, and this is based on figures from this year, was around 148 billion. So they're spending quite a lot in Africa. And although India, it's probably not going to be possible anytime soon for them to catch up in terms of absolute spending power, they do have this element that Africa doesn't, which is their diaspora. And if we look at like numbers, India is leading China in that respect. So China currently has around 1 million of its diaspora in Africa, while India has around 3 million. So if we look exactly now at what characteristics or what characterizes China's engagement with Africa, it's based primarily on bilateral deals. So you're looking at like your state-to-state deals, essentially. And then Taylor 2012 highlighted that these are the extractive industries and your infrastructure development. India's engagement with the region, however, is slightly different. It's more commercially driven and private. And then, so as opposed to like your state deals, India's more private industry presence actually gives it a bit more ability to utilize its diaspora in that way. It should also be noted that India's diaspora in Africa has only recently been seen as a strategic tool for economic and political development. It wasn't a direct result of Narendra Modi's like succession into Indian Parliament, but he definitely increased it, definitely put focus on its increasing importance for India and its like foreign policy. Global Business Outlook actually classified Modi's strategies as being about self-assurance. They had these visionary outcomes and they were global in scope. And then that last term, global in global in scope is of particular importance because it reflects the growing willingness of Indian government to utilize whatever avenues it has at its disposal in order to increase its global impact, one being its diaspora. So under Modi, India's engagements with its diaspora has taken on a whole new role and meaning. Mishra calls this moving from active dissociation to proactive association in recent years. So while this idea of proactive association was only formally addressed and acknowledged by Modi fairly recently, last couple of years, I guess, it's important to note that India's vision to engage with its diaspora was not totally absent from its policy decisions, right? This wasn't just like a brand new idea that Modi decided to focus on as soon as he got elected. If we look at Nehru's Overseas Indian Initiative in 1998, earlier than that, which was changed to the People of Indian Origin Initiative in 1998, it reflected, again, less of this romantic idea of connecting with diasporas, but it sort of solidified the diaspora for India and their interest in tapping into the investable funds, as Modi and Taylor put it, of its diaspora. So essentially, this whole like shift of moving or of solidifying this whole person of Indian origin card, I guess you could say, well, essentially signified India trying to like engage more with its diaspora, right? Which kind of shows how they started to seek interest in using it as a strategic tool. Another initiative set up by the Indian government, note that this was also pre-Modi, but I'm including it here because it also shows how India slowly began to engage with its diasporic populations in Africa. So this was the High-Level Committee on Indian Diaspora, which was introduced 2 years after the PIO was introduced. So it was a plan essentially to set up an institution that was primarily focused on, this is from the Ministry of External Affairs, studying the global Indian diaspora and to recommend measures for a constructive relationship with them. So I guess essentially this initiative represents India recognizing the importance of its diaspora in Africa as a significant tool for political and economic engagement. The Indian diaspora, after all, do contribute a fair amount back to India, economic-wise. As Guennoun noted, the Indian diaspora is the only one, or is one that sends the most remittances back to their home country. I think the value was around 70 billion. And then remittances, as pointed out by Sinha 2019, are actually quite beneficial to the Indian economy. They're actually on par with international aid in terms of like funding to developing countries. The money sent through remittances by India's Africa diasporic population, I think it's not that much. I think it's around $500 million. I think compared to like your other Western countries, but I mean, still significant nonetheless. And it's helped India in terms of improving its own income distribution and higher living standards and stuff. I mean, only a little bit, basically. So in this way, India can and has benefited quite a lot from its diaspora in Africa, as mentioned in terms of the remittances. The importance then for the government in engaging with its diaspora is important, and even more so with Africa because of this potential of forming now two-way relationships, right? So additionally, this whole idea of the high-level committee on Indian diaspora of like building constructive relationships with the Indian diaspora for the Indian government anyways, is important because this initiative aimed at essentially building bridges with, is important because building bridges with one's diasporic group often leads to increases in trade, FDI, businesses, entrepreneurship, and just the general transfer of knowledge and skills. India then has this sort of channel, I guess you could say, to Africa with their diaspora population because they serve as a way to promote these economic interests, right? In terms of like trade and whatever business creation and stuff. So in fact, if we look at in 2006, a study of over 450 businesses in Africa revealed that over half of the owners were ethically Indian, which is not a huge amount if you think of it in comparison to how many businesses there are in Africa. But obviously, the survey wasn't taking into account all businesses. But it shows that there definitely is a contribution of India's diaspora in Africa in terms of its economy. It also then is reflective of India's trade and its exports to Africa. Between 2017 and 2018, some of the largest African countries for India's exports were South Africa with 3.5 billion, Kenya with 2.1 billion in exports, Tanzania with 1.7 billion, and Mauritius with 881 million. Evidently, these are the countries in Africa with a very strong presence of Indian diaspora. This then is reflective of this opportunity that India has to utilize its diaspora as a tool to engage with Africa. It can use its population in the countries mentioned, its diasporic populations, to negotiate trade deals and even use those existing numbers, like South Africa and Kenya, both with over 1 billion in exports, as evidence for the benefits of trading with them. Its diaspora in Africa also provides the Indian government with a useful excuse for investment in the region, if you think about it. It can justify investment or even the setup of different institutions in Africa as a way of providing support and connectivity to diasporic populations. And then this by default would give India some sort of footing in the region and create additional links between the two regions, regardless, I guess, of how impactful these are. But then in this case, you would sort of argue that some connection there is better than nothing, especially with the rise of China. So the impact, therefore, of India's diaspora in Africa serves as a useful network and entry point to facilitate trade and investment. Another important point to consider with India's diaspora, generally, but even specifically in Africa, is in terms of economic and business interests, the influence of well-off and high-profile diasporic actors or members. Mohammed Dewji, for example, he is the CEO of the Tanzanian conglomerate Metal, or METL, and is a very successful and influential businessman in Tanzania, who has Indian origins, obviously. Dewji's network is around $1.6 billion, and he also served 2 terms in Tanzania's National Assembly. So influential people of India, which is a point that I do come back to later, so influential people like Dewji, they also have the potential, I guess, for being useful as strategic tools in terms of just facilitating links and even unofficial diplomacy interactions between Africa and India. And then in the specific case with Mohammed Dewji, it would be the connections between Tanzania and India. It's just like a useful bridge, I guess. Now, if we look to the impact of diaspora on political and diplomatic interests, it is important to note that the relationships would just evidently stem from these economic ones. In recent years, utilization of India's diaspora in Africa has now become more of a focus. I mentioned before, as Modi took office in 2014. This is especially evident via his foreign policy strategies that have been defined as underpinned by this whole idea of universal engagement, right? And as part of this, the Indian diaspora in Africa have been pinned as a vital element of these strategies. This once more is another way that India differs from China. India's relationship with Africa is largely governed by private and soft power avenues, as I mentioned before, which evidently would be underpinned in one way or another by the diasporic population and these cultural connections that India and Africa share or could share. China, on the other hand, has a relationship with Africa that is largely based on state economic support. This provides India with a unique advantage because having those people-to-people connections and relations presents an opportunity for them to engage more effectively and closely with Africa. in a way that China arguably can't, because they don't have a very strong presence to build their people-to-people relationships. And yeah, so again, this is because, so these connections, people-to-people connections, also have the potential to be more effective than your standard just state-based connections and like your economic deals, which are, I guess, just standard propaganda tools. And then this again is because of the personal relationships you can build by connecting and engaging with people who are from the same origin country as you, essentially. So India's utilization of its diasporic population in this way, i.e. using its diaspora as an unofficial diplomacy tool, I guess, to forge stronger relationships with countries in Africa, they can be seen in effect through the tours that Modi has made when he was inaugurated as PM of India. Through his visits to African countries, he was able to attract huge amounts of Indian diaspora in those nations, and was also known just overall to have very successful engagement with them. So the way that Modi was able to connect with the diaspora, often during the large gatherings that he had, like when he came to the country, served as Singh put it, to make India's diaspora a visible political community, right? And then that was obvious with the large amounts that were gathering when he was like coming into the country. If we consider then how this may be used as a strategic tool to build bridges between Africa and India, let's just look back again to this term of unofficial diplomacy. During political and diplomatic conversations, instead of just leveraging things like your investment deals, trade deals, and business ventures, which are very important, I'm not negating their impact, India could also lean on its diaspora population. It would serve as, like, to some extent, to connect the two countries beyond just your standard state-based deals. An interesting point to make here is the reputation in general that India's diaspora has in the world, and then also in Africa. As Singh 2020 noted, the Indian diaspora has been one of the most prosperous communities in their host countries. They have become known to hold significant economic and also political power. The reputation then also has the potential to help India in its diplomatic relations with Africa. If India's diaspora have already this reputation of being fairly successful, this is a generalization, but yeah, then it is likely that Africa will be willing to engage and be more friendly with them, because it would have the expectation that India's diaspora could benefit them. So then again, it's this importance, of building your people-to-people connections and relationships. So then this leads to this next point, which is focusing particularly on the successful people in Africa who have Indian origin. As Singh 2020 noted, this particular portion of the diasporic group, they occupy prime positions in the corporate and even political world. So a few notable mentions that I included were Abraham Patel, who is a South African cabinet minister, and he also holds the position of Minister of Trade, Industry and Competition. Then you have Franny Ginwala, who was the Speaker of the National Assembly of South Africa from 1994 to 2004. And then you have Navi Pillay, who was a South African who served as the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights from 2008 to 2014. And then also another fun fact about Navi Pillay was that she was the first non-white woman who held the position as a judge on the High Court of South Africa. So these are just a few examples, but they are reflective of the significance of Indian diaspora in Africa for building connections and bridges between the two countries. The prominence of these actors in Africa with Indian origin could potentially be a useful tool that India might be able to use to try to build its relationship with Africa. Moreover, the influence and visibility of India's diaspora in this way means that there is a possibility that India could use them as a way to secure markets in Africa for trade or investment or whatever. If you look at Abraham Patel, Minister of Trade, and yeah, additionally, the fact that there are several members of parliament who are of Indian origin in Africa, like the South African National Assembly, for example, means that they are influential in the decision making in the region, right? These people who have Indian origin are essentially influential in African politics to some extent. This then means that compared to other countries that engage with Africa, so obviously China was the one that I've been using in comparison, India has this sort of like starting point, like a head start, I guess that's what I'm looking for. So to get this like personal link, right, which like China wouldn't have. China has their money, but then India has this sort of like, yeah, link and like this shared thing. So yeah, and then like I said, like Abraham Patel, who's South African Minister for Trade, which I imagine that for India, in terms of engaging with South Africa, it would be a beneficial person to have as part of their, trade group. Now, this is not to say that this is something that is currently happening in Africa's engagements with India. And obviously, I imagine that there's obviously like a certain extent to which India can actually use these political connections. I mean, I'm not even sure that they are, but yeah, I'm sure that there would be issues from like conflict of interest and stuff. And I'm not by any means like an expert on India and Africa relationships, but I do think that these sorts of like people to people interactions are useful to think about, even if you think about them hypothetically. So if we sort of like move on to the conclusion now, it's kind of clear or evident that India's diaspora in Africa serve as a very unique opportunity for them to engage with the region, both politically and economically and even culturally, in a way that other global powers can't or would find difficult to. But India must also be strategic in how it uses its diaspora. There's this point of this whole resentment to a certain extent of high profile actors in in Africa who are of Indian origin. So essentially these resentment against these economically powerful actors who are ethnically Indian. And then it won't probably be beneficial for India if African citizens are just thinking that it's like utilizing these actors to just advance India's agenda. So then this sort of calls into the importance that India needs to be strategic and utilize its diasporic actors very carefully, and essentially make sure that to whatever extent they are advancing their economic interests, they're not simultaneously hindering Africa's. So yeah, that's it for me. I'll just stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much. That was great. And we'll move to the questions right away. Okay, so the first question for you is, what do you think should the international community prioritize to recover better from the pandemic?
I think definitely cooperation, or just like, I think definitely cooperation between different states, as like the whole like diasporic, or the impact of like your diasporic population shows. We're definitely a very interconnected world. There are just like people moving all over. It's not going to be viable in the future for like countries to just operate on their own accord with no consideration, I guess, for like how their actions can affect other states. Because essentially, if we think like in bigger terms, like whatever one country decides to do in terms of like their domestic thing has like some way of like influencing the whole like international sphere. And then also probably like the economic structure of the global economy. I think that needs to be reevaluated. I don't know to what extent it can be changed, but yeah, obviously as this like pandemic has shown, there's like a big disparity in terms of the way like the whole economy is based on this idea of like trickle down economics, right? It's this whole like capitalist or for the most part, this whole like capitalist notion. But then I guess as we've seen, I don't know how well that whole like trickle down economics thing has worked. So yeah, probably those two things.
Okay, then let me ask you a follow-up question. Then, like, how important or not is it for countries to work together to manage these very trends?
Yeah, I think definitely extremely important. Again, as the pandemic has shown, we're like super connected. Obviously, in the way that the pandemic has affected literally every single, well, not every single country, but pretty much all countries. And how would that have happened if we weren't an interconnected, like, world? And then obviously we've seen the impacts of that. Even if you just look at like travel, like the fact that the whole thing just shut down and then countries like suffered because of that shows how dependent we are on, or how reliant we are on like connecting with each other. And then even if we think about connectivity in terms of like information and knowledge, how would we like, I think, yeah, it would, if we, yeah, look at the whole like China, if we weren't a connected world and like states weren't cooperating, how would we have gotten the pandemic thing? I mean, I'm not saying it's in control, but in terms of like information about like what the virus is and where it came from, like how would we have gotten that if we weren't connecting with each other? So yeah, definitely extremely important. Yeah.
All right, we're almost out of time, so we'll just stop right here. And yeah, this brings us to the end of